Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today, I'll be reading another essay of Arthur Schopenhauer's. This one is titled, Character. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our channel members, Joshua Anolik, Torritz, Catherine McMillan, Dink Smallwood, and Ronnie Limestone. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can do so in multiple ways. If you'd like to become a member, you can find information linked in the description below. If you're looking for a way to support the channel for free, liking, sharing, and subscribing goes a long way. Thanks for listening. Men who aspire to a happy, a brilliant, and a long life, instead of to a virtuous one, are like foolish actors who want to be always having the great parts, the parts that are marked by splendor and triumph. They fail to see that the important thing is not what or how much, but how they act. Since a man does not alter, and his moral character remains absolutely the same all through his life, since he must play out the part which he has received, without the least deviation from the character, since neither experience, nor philosophy, nor religion can effect any improvement in him, the question arises, what is the meaning of life at all? To what purpose is it played, this farce in which everything that is essential is irrevocably fixed and determined? It is played so that a man may come to understand himself, that he may see what it is that he seeks and has sought to be, what he wants, and what, therefore, he is. This is a knowledge which must be imparted to him from without. Life is to man, in other words, to will what chemical reagents are to the body. It is only by life that a man reveals what he is, and it is only in so far as he reveals himself that he exists at all. Life is the manifestation of character, of the something that we understand by that word, and it is not in life, but outside of it, and outside of time, that character undergoes alteration, as a result of the self-knowledge which life gives. Life is only the mirror into which a man gazes, not in order that he may get a reflection of himself, but that he may come to understand himself by that reflection, that he may see what it is that the mirror shows. Life is the proof sheet in which the compositor's errors are brought to light. How they become visible, and whether the type is large or small, are matters of no consequence. Neither in the externals of life, nor in the course of history is there any significance. For as it is all one whether an error occurs in the large type or the small, so it is all one as regards the essence of the matter, whether an evil disposition is mirrored as a conqueror of the world, or a common swindler, or ill-natured egoist. In one case he is seen of all men, and in the other perhaps only of himself. But that he should see himself is what signifies. Therefore, if egoism has a firm hold of a man and masters him, whether it be in the form of joy, or triumph, or lust, or hope, or frantic grief, or annoyance, or anger, or fear, or suspicion, or passion of any kind, he is in the devil's clutches, and how he got into them does not matter. What is needful is that he should make haste to get out of them, and here again, it does not matter how. I have described character as theoretically an act of will lying beyond time, of which life in time, or character in action, is the development. For matters of practical life, we all possess the one as well as the other, for we are constituted of them both. Character modifies our life more than we think, and it is to a certain extent true that every man is the architect of his own fortune. No doubt it seems as if our lot were assigned to us almost entirely from without, and imparted to us in something of the same way in which a melody outside us reaches the ear. But on looking back over our past, we see at once that our life consists of mere variations on one and the same theme, namely our character, and that the same fundamental bass sounds through it all. This is an experience which a man can and must make in and by himself. Not only a man's life, but his intellect too may be possessed of a clear and definite character, so far as his intellect is applied to matters of theory. It is not every man, however, who has an intellect of this kind, For any such definite individuality as I mean is genius, an original view of the world, which presupposes an absolutely exceptional individuality, which is the essence of genius. A man's intellectual character is the theme on which all of his works are variations. In an essay which I wrote in Weimar, I called it the knack by which every genius produces his works, however various. This intellectual character determines the physiognomy of men of genius, what I might call the theoretical physiognomy, and gives it that distinguished expression which is chiefly seen in the eyes and the forehead. In the case of ordinary men, the physiognomy presents no more than a weak analogy with the physiognomy of genius. On the other hand, all men possess the practical physiognomy, the stamp of will, of practical character, of moral disposition, and it shows itself chiefly in the mouth. Since character, so far as we understand its nature, is above and beyond time, it cannot undergo any change under the influence of life. But although it must necessarily remain the same always, it requires time to unfold itself and show the very diverse aspects which it may possess. For character consists of two factors: one, the will to live itself, blind impulse, so-called impetuosity; the other, the restraint which the will acquires when it comes to understand the world. And the world, again, is itself will. A man may begin by following the craving of desire until he comes to see how hollow and unreal a thing is life, how deceitful are its pleasures, what horrible aspects it possesses, and this it is that makes people hermits, penitents, and Magdalenes. Nevertheless, it is to be observed that no such change from a life of great indulgence in pleasure to one of resignation is possible, except to the man who of his own accord renounces pleasure. A really bad life cannot be changed into a virtuous one. The most beautiful soul, before it comes to know life from its horrible side, may eagerly drink the sweets of life and remain innocent. But it cannot commit a bad action, it cannot cause others suffering to do a pleasure to itself. For in that case it would see clearly what it would be doing, and whatever be its youth and inexperience, it perceives the sufferings of others as clearly as its own pleasures. That is why one bad action is a guarantee that numberless others will be committed as soon as circumstances give occasion for them. Somebody once remarked to me with entire justice that every man had something very good and humane in his disposition, and also something very bad and malignant, and that according as he was moved, one or the other of them made its appearance. The sight of others' suffering arouses, not only in different men, but in one and the same man, at one moment an inexhaustible sympathy, at another a certain satisfaction, and this satisfaction may increase until it becomes the cruelest delight in pain. I observe in myself that at one moment I regard all mankind with heartfelt pity, at another with the greatest indifference, on occasion with hatred, nay, with a positive enjoyment of their pain. All of this shows very clearly that we are possessed of two different, nay, absolutely contradictory ways of regarding the world. One, according to the principle of individuation, which exhibits all creatures as entire strangers to us, as definitely not ourselves. We can have no feelings for them but those of indifference, envy, hatred, and delight that they suffer. The other way of regarding the world is in accordance with what I may call the tat tuam asi, this is thyself principle. All creatures are exhibited as identical with ourselves, and so it is pity and love which the sight of them arouses. The one method separates individuals by impassable barriers. The other removes the barrier and brings the individuals together. The one makes us feel, in regard to every man, that is what I am. The other, that is not what I am. But it is remarkable that while the sight of another's suffering makes us feel our identity with him and arouses our pity, this is not so with the sight of another's happiness. Then we almost always feel some envy, and even though we may have no such feeling in certain cases, as for instance when our friends are happy, yet the interest which we take in their happiness is of a weak description, and cannot compare with the sympathy which we feel with their suffering. Is this because we recognize all happiness to be a delusion, or an impediment to true welfare? No. I am inclined to think that it is because the sight of the pleasure, or the possessions which are denied to us, arouses envy. That is to say, the wish that we, and not the other, had that pleasure or those possessions. It is only the first way of looking at the world which is founded on any demonstrable reason. The other is, as it were, the gate out of this world. It has no attestation beyond itself, unless it be the very abstract and difficult proof which my doctrine supplies. Why the first way predominates in one man and the second in another, though perhaps it does not exclusively predominate in any man, why the one or the other emerges according as the will is moved, these are deep problems. The paths of night and day are close together. It is a fact that there is a great and original difference between one empirical character and another, and it is a difference which, at bottom, rests upon the relation of the individual's will to his intellectual faculty. This relation is finally determined by the degree of will in his father and of intellect in his mother, and the union of father and mother is for the most part an affair of chance. This would all mean a revolting injustice in the nature of the world, if it were not that the difference between parents and son is phenomenal only, and chance is, at bottom, necessity. As regards the freedom of the will, if it were the case that the will manifested itself in a single act alone, it would be a free act. But the will manifests itself in a course of life, that is to say, in a series of acts. Every one of these acts, therefore, is determined as a part of a complete whole, and cannot happen otherwise than it does happen. On the other hand, the whole series is free. It is simply the manifestation of an individualized will. If a man feels inclined to commit a bad action and refrains, he is kept back either 1, by fear of punishment or vengeance, or 2, by superstition, in other words, fear of punishment in a future life, or 3, by the feeling of sympathy, including general charity, or 4, by the feeling of honor, in other words, the fear of shame, or 5, by the feeling of justice, that is, an objective attachment to fidelity and good faith, coupled with the resolve to hold them sacred, because they are the foundation of all free intercourse between man and man, and therefore often of advantage to himself as well. This last thought, not indeed as a thought, but as a mere feeling, influences people very frequently. It is this that often compels a man of honor, when some great but unjust advantage is offered him, to reject it with contempt, and proudly exclaim, "I am an honorable man." For otherwise, how should a poor man, confronted with the property which chance, or even some worse agency, has bestowed on the rich, whose very existence it is that makes him poor, feel so much sincere respect for this property that he refuses to touch it even in his need? And although he has a prospect of escaping punishment, what other thought is it that can be at the bottom of such a man's honesty? He is resolved not to separate himself from the great community of honorable people who have the earth in possession, and whose laws are recognized everywhere. He knows that a single dishonest act will ostracize and proscribe him from that society forever. No, a man will spend money on any soil that yields him good fruit, and he will make sacrifices for it. With a good action, that every action in which a man's own advantage is ostensibly subordinated to another's, the motive is either 1, self-interest, kept in the background, or 2, superstition. In other words, self-interest in the form of reward in another life. Or 3, sympathy. Or 4, the desire to lend a helping hand. In other words, attachment to the maxim that we should assist one another in need, and the wish to maintain this maxim in view of the presumption that some day we ourselves may find it serve our turn. For what Kant calls a good action done from motives of duty and for the sake of duty, there is, as will be seen, no room at all. Kant himself declares it to be doubtful whether an action was ever determined by pure motives of duty alone. I affirm most certainly that no action was ever so done. It is mere babble. There is nothing in it that could really act as a motive to any man. When he shelters himself behind verbiage of that sort, he is always actuated by one of the four motives which I have described. Among these, it is obviously sympathy alone which is quite genuine and sincere. Good and bad apply to character only a posteriori. That is to say, we prefer the good to the bad. But, absolutely, there is no such distinction. The difference arises at the point which lies between subordinating one's own advantage to that of another and not subordinating it. If a man keeps to the exact middle, he is just. But most men go an inch in their regard for others' welfare to 20 yards in regard for their own. The source of good and of bad character, so far as we have any real knowledge of it, lies in this, that with the bad character the thought of the external world, and especially of the living creatures in it, is accompanied all the more, the greater the resemblance between them and the individual self, by a constant feeling of not I, not I, not I. Contrarily, with the good character, both being assumed to exist in a high degree, the same thought has for its accompaniment, like a fundamental base, a constant feeling of I. From this spring benevolence and a disposition to help all men, and at the same time a cheerful, confident, and tranquil frame of mind, the opposite of that which accompanies the bad character. The difference, however, is only phenomenal, although it is a difference which is radical. But now we come to the hardest of all problems. How is it that, while the will, as the thing in itself, is identical, and, from a metaphysical point of view, one and the same in all of its manifestations, there is nevertheless such an enormous difference between one character and another, the malicious, diabolical wickedness of the one, and set off against it the goodness of the other, showing all the more conspicuously? How is it that we get a Tiberius, a Caligula, a Caracalla, a Domitian, a Nero, and on the other hand, the Antonines, Titus, Hadrian, Nerva? How is it that among the animals, nay, in a higher species, in individual animals, there is a like difference? The malignity of the cat most strongly developed in the tiger, the spite of the monkey on the other hand, goodness, fidelity, and love in the dog and the elephant. It is obvious that the principle of wickedness in the brute is the same as in man. We may, to some extent, modify the difficulty of the problem by observing that the whole difference is in the end only one of degree. In every living creature, the fundamental propensities and instincts all exist, but they exist in very different degrees and proportions. This, however, is not enough to explain the facts. We must fall back upon the intellect and its relation to the will. It is the only explanation that remains. A man's intellect, however, by no means stands in any direct and obvious relation with the goodness of his character. We may, it is true, discriminate between two kinds of intellect, between understanding, as the apprehension of relation in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason, and cognition, a faculty akin to genius, which acts more directly, is independent of this law, and passes beyond the principle of individuation. The latter is the faculty which apprehends ideas, and it is the faculty which has to do with morality. But even this explanation leaves much to be desired. Fine minds are seldom fine souls, was the correct observation of Jean Paul, although they are never the contrary. Lord Bacon, who, to be sure, was less of a fine soul than a fine mind, was a scoundrel. I have declared space and time to be part of the principle of individuation, as it is only space and time that make the multiplicity of similar objects a possibility. But multiplicity itself also admits of variety. Multiplicity and diversity are not only quantitative, but also qualitative. How is it that there is such a thing as qualitative diversity especially in ethical matters? Or have I fallen into an error, the opposite of that in which Leibniz fell with his identitas indiscernibilium? The chief cause of intellectual diversity is to be found in the brain and the nervous system. This is a fact which somewhat lessens the obscurity of the subject. With the brutes, the intellect and the brain are strictly adapted to their aims and needs. With man alone there is, now and then, by way of exception, a superfluity, which, if it is abundant, may yield genius. But ethical diversity, it seems, proceeds immediately from the will. Otherwise, ethical character would not be above and beyond time, as it is only in the individual that intellect and will are united. The will is above and beyond time, and eternal, and character is innate. That is to say, it is sprung from the same eternity, and therefore it does not admit of any but a transcendental explanation. Perhaps someone will come after me who will throw light into this dark abyss.